Let's focus now. The US elections are just over 2 months away. Both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are pulling out all stops, intensifying their campaigns and keeping up appearances in battleground states. But over the weekend, news of 6 hostages getting killed in Gaza has put the long overdue ceasefire and hostage deal in the spotlight. While the ruling administration is trying to douse the fire, the Red Camp is amping pressure on Joe Biden. The Republican presidential nominee slammed Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, blaming them for the hostage deaths, who included Israeli-American citizen Hersh Goldberg-Polin. Trump on social media minced no words in slamming Biden-Harris for poor leadership and saying that they have blood on their hands. Other Republican lawmakers lashed out at the US president not for pushing through a hostage deal. But on the contrary, the Red Camp has blamed the Biden-Harris administration for not supporting Israel strongly enough. One Republican has gone as far as saying the current leadership has encouraged and emboldened Hamas. Another Republican lawmaker has pointed fingers at Iran, urging Washington to target the country's oil refineries if hostages are not released. In the blue camp, Kamala Harris is under immense pressure. All eyes are now waiting to see what the incumbent vice president and Biden's successor says or does next, as the focus of many American voters shifts to Gaza and America's Israel policy. It was just days ago that parents of Hersh Goldberg-Polin made an appearance at the Democratic National Convention. Inside the venue, desperate parents addressed the dire need for a deal to bring hostages home. And outside, just a short distance away, pro-Palestine protests rocked Chicago, calling for a ceasefire and delivery of aid to millions suffering in Gaza. Today, the streets of New York are witnessing a fresh wave of protests triggered by the death of the Israeli-American, among 5 others.
Bring them home! 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 4 hours.
Of the total hostages that Hamas captured on October 7th last year, 7 of the remaining hostages in Gaza are American citizens. Washington says that 3 of the hostages have died in captivity and the fate of 4 others remain unknown. For the moment, growing calls for a hostage deal and ceasefire in Gaza have seemingly become a flashpoint in the US elections. And in a week, both political rivals are expected to take the podium for the highly awaited presidential debate. And to take this story further, we are being joined by Jeffrey Cabaservice from Virginia. He is the Vice President of Political Studies, Niskanen Center, and the author of Rule and Ruin. Jeffrey, Mr. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us here on WION. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Let me start by asking you this. How much of what happens in Gaza and Israel actually affects an average American voter?
It probably is true that the average American voter is not paying close attention to the situation in Gaza and Israel. However, the situation certainly does affect American politics because it's so divisive on the Democratic side. Kamala Harris has the virtue of being indirectly tied to Joe Biden's record of support for Israel. Certainly her supporters wish to see her as more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. On the other hand, she hasn't had to take any firm positions really on one side or the other. The killing of the hostages in most recently probably will put more pressure on her to come out one way or another.
Right. Mr. Jeffrey, since you say that Kamala Harris, her supporters are looking for her to be more sympathetic when it comes to her West Asia policy and specifically to what's happening in Gaza, do you think she will be more sympathetic?
I think the perception is that Kamala Harris, having been someone come from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, has more sympathy towards the Palestinians. And I think almost certainly she will feel freer to criticize the Netanyahu government than Joe Biden has so far. On the other hand, the American public is rather divided, and the Democratic Party is deeply divided on this issue. I should emphasize that Gaza is not an issue that divides the Republicans. If anything, they are trying to tell the Biden administration that they should have given Israel and Netanyahu government a freer hand in rooting out the terrorists.
Right. Speaking of the Republicans, I have a quote by Donald Trump. He has reacted to what's happened in Gaza. He says, and I'm quoting, "American citizens murdered by Hamas due to poor leadership of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. This terror would have never happened if I were president." Typical Trump speaking, but it's just 2 months before elections. It's a good time to ask, what is Donald Trump's strategy towards West Asia?
Donald Trump doesn't really have a strategy, so to speak. He can point to certain successes in the Middle East in his administration, such as the Abraham Accords. However, he has not said definitively how he would respond in the case of the current Gaza situation. The Republican Party generally, though, seems to favor the Netanyahu government taking even more active measures to combat Hamas, regardless of the civilian casualties. This presents a problem, in a sense, for the protesters on the Democratic side. If the extent that they're damaging the Harris campaign over the Gaza issue, the beneficiary would be Donald Trump and a harder line toward Palestine.
Right, Mr. Jeffrey, very quickly, I'm being told I'm running out of time, but the hopes are really low at the moment for a ceasefire and hostage deal. But say that we do have one in the next 2 months. How do you think that immediately affects what happens on November 5th?
You know, I think that the Democrats would benefit more from a ceasefire than the Republicans. And I think the question of the terms would be important here. If the Biden administration and the incipient Harris administration was seen as having overly favored Hamas, then there would be an opening for criticism from the Republicans. But I think the general sense of the American people is that this has been a tragic conflict. They would like to see the hostages, and particularly the Americans, released. And it would probably, if there was a ceasefire, be a more optimistic moment for the American public, which in the end could favor the Democrats.
All right, Mr. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us here on WION. Good to speak to you.
Good to speak to you as well.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.